Welcome to the first of PERITIA Public Lectures on the theme of trust in an age of disinformation. I am Maria Bagramian. I'm a professor of philosophy at University College Dublin School of Philosophy. I'm also the coordinator of the PERITIA project. The PERITIA is a multidisciplinary project investigating the question of public trust in experts through a grant provided for us by the European Commission under their Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Funding Project. The group comprises of 11 institutions spread over countries across Europe, and today's lectures are co-hosted by CEPALS, the Center for Ethics in Public Life in UCD, and the American University of Armenia. The lectures are simultaneously translated into Armenian, and you can avail of the translation function by going to the bottom of your screen and tapping on the link that indicates on the right-hand side that allows you to listen to the lecture either in English or in Armenian. I will make that announcement very quickly in Armenian as well for Armenian participants. Բարևձեզ, շնորհակալ եմ, որ տեսնում եմ ձեզի այստեղ, բարևեք եկել մեր PERITIA ժողովին։ Մենք ապահովում ենք հայերեն համընթաց թարգմանություն, եթե ուզում եք այս դասախոսությունը լսեք հայերենով, ձեր Zoom-ի պատուհանի ներքևի աջ կողմի tracking interpretation Armenia կանչված, այսինքն թարգմանություն հայերեն տարբերակը խնդրում եմ անցեք։ So today's this series of lectures is moderated by my colleague from the School of Education at University College Dublin, Dr. Shane Bergen. Dr. Bergen is a physicist by training, but a science communicator and educator by vocation. Shortly after this series of lectures, Dr. Bergen will also prepare a series of podcasts based on the themes from these lectures, and we are looking forward to these podcasts, and we will share the links with you all and beyond through the PERITIA's usual channels. But today's lecture is by one of the most important international voices in the crucial debate on the role of science in public life. And we are absolutely delighted and honored to have Professor Naomi Oreskes with us. So I will now ask Dr. Bergen to introduce Professor Oreskes. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, and a very good morning, indeed, good afternoon or good evening to you. And you're very welcome to a virtual University College Dublin. My name is Shane Bergen. Our speaker today is Professor Naomi Oreskes. Naomi is the Henry Charles Lea Professor of History of Science at Harvard University. And we are delighted to have her here today with us. Professor Oreskes is a world-renowned geologist, historian, and as you'd see, a public speaker. She's a leading voice on the role of science in society and the reality of anthropogenic climate change. Professor Oreskes is an author or co-author of 7 books, over 150 articles, essays, and opinion pieces. These include books such as Merchants of Doubt, a book by her and co-author Conway that describes how a handful of scientists obscured the truth on issues such as tobacco smoking to global warming. The Huffington Post described its brutal clarity in pulling back the carpet on this dark corner of science. And perhaps is one of the many reasons that this book has been both praised and attacked around the world. Professor Oreskes' book, The Collapse of Western Civilization, is a haunting, provocative work of science-based fiction. In it, Oreskes and Conway imagine a world devastated by climate change, dramatizing the science in ways that traditional nonfiction cannot. The book reasserts the importance of the way scientists are and the way they work. And this brings us to Why Trust Science, the title of Professor Oreskes' latest book, and indeed the title of today's lecture. I'm sure that, like me, Many of you have enjoyed reading this book. Dr. Elizabeth Gilmore, writing in Science magazine, described it as an optimistic analysis of the opportunities that exist for enhancing public trust in science. This book should be mandatory reading for anyone who is part of the scientific endeavour. I couldn't agree more. My students and I enjoyed a conversation on it just recently. So we look forward to Professor Oreskes' talk today, and we're delighted that so many of you are tuning in from around the world to join us. We will have questions at the end of the lecture. So if you'd like to pose a question, you can do so at the bottom of your screen using the questions and answers button. We will have an hour for the formal piece, and there may be some sort of backstage chat following the official ending of today's lecture series. This is the first lecture series, the first lecture in the series, and so at the end I'll give some information about what you can expect in the coming weeks. But for now, I couldn't think of a better way to start this lecture series by introducing Professor Naomi Oreskes on her talk, Why Trust Science. Over to you, Naomi.
Thank you very much. Well, it's an honor and a pleasure to be with you today and to be able to kick off this lecture series. And thank you very much for the kind words about my books. And today is a very good day to be launching this lecture series because it's also the day that the paperback edition of Why Trust Science is being released. And if you go to my Twitter feed, there's a discount code where you can order the book at a discount from Princeton University Press. All right, so I'm going to share the screen now. So let's do that. And yeah, that looks good to me. Is it good at your end? Okay, I'm assuming if nobody objects, it means you can see it.
That's perfect. We can see it. Thank you so much.
Good, perfect. Okay, so and let me just, okay. So I thought I could start today by speaking a little bit about why I wrote this book, especially because this year with the pandemic and all the questions about science related to the vaccinations and the mask mandate, everyone has been telling me how timely this book is. But of course, anytime a book is timely, it means you actually wrote it 5 years before, or at least you had the idea for it. So let me talk a little bit about the background to the book. So the main reason I wrote this book came out of public lectures that I was giving about climate change over the past 10, 15 years. After Merchants of Doubt came out, both Eric Conway and I got a lot of invitations to speak in public about the issues that book raised. And one of the things that I felt in giving these public talks was that it wasn't enough to say to people, trust us, we're experts, that our audience deserves an explanation for the answer to this question, why should we trust science? An explanation for why science deserves our trust, if indeed it does, and also an honest appraisal of some of the problems in science when sometimes maybe science doesn't actually deserve our trust. A second reason has to do with scientific uncertainty. One of the techniques that climate change deniers use is to exaggerate or to overemphasize the uncertainty in science. And this is a very dirty trick because, as we all know, anyone who's done science or studies science knows science is intrinsically uncertain. There are at least two major reasons for that. One is simply that science is a process of learning and discovery. And that means that almost by definition, when we learn new things, it will show that some of the things we used to think might not be right or might not be complete. And so there's always a certain intrinsic uncertainty associated with the knowledge that as we learn more, we will have to adjust our views. And this is also related to a kind of deep, what we could call philosophical intrinsic uncertainty, that no matter what we do, we can never say that something has been proven in an absolute sense. And philosophers of science, of course, have spilled a lot of ink on this issue. We know that on some deep level, our knowledge is always provisional. And so therefore, there's a certain humility that we ought to carry when we discuss scientific findings. But if we are honest about that, then other people could exploit that for negative purposes. There's a wonderful book by the historian David Jurafsky about the Lysenko affair, a very famous and sad episode in the history of science, where the Soviet government promoted false theories about evolution. And one of the things that Jurafsky says at the end of the book is if we think about the lessons of these stories, we realize that the world's scientific communities cannot claim absolute truth, But what we can fairly claim is that we are closer than anyone else to genuine knowledge concerning our particular fields of study. Well, I think that's right. I think that's a very nice summary of the situation, but it still invites the question, well, how do we really know that? Can we reconcile the fact that science is inherently uncertain with the claim that scientists are, quote, closer than anyone else to the truth in their areas of study? Then a third reason that I was motivated to think more about the problem of trust in science came out of the work I did with Eric Conway in Merchants of Doubt. What we showed in that book was that some people had deliberately generated public mistrust of science, and that they had did it in order to prevent appropriate policy. The story began with the role of the tobacco industry, and we showed how the fossil fuel industry had used the same strategies and tactics to deliberately create mistrust in science that showed the damaging effects of their products. So for all these different reasons, and probably some others as well, it seemed to me important to try to take on the question, why trust science? To take this challenge seriously and to try as best as possible to answer it. And then, of course, COVID-19 hit. And let me just say one thing about that. I think we've all seen in so many ways in the last year how distrust in science is damaging, how the challenge of communicating good scientific information is a very profound one, and how it's not just a philosophical issue, but it's an issue in which our health, our safety, and even our very lives depend. So let's go back a little bit in time. For me, whenever I think about the problem of uncertainty, I think about the problem of Pascal's wager. So many of you have heard of Pascal, an important philosopher, scientist, and mathematician. But Pascal thought that the most important question of all in philosophy was the question of the existence of God. Does God exist? And Pascal posed what we would today think of as the problem of the type 1 versus the type 2 error. He said, well, let's think of it this way. If I cannot prove one way or the other whether or not God exists, then I can ask the question, what are the relative risks of believing in God if he does not exist versus not believing if he does? And when you put it that way, the answer is obvious. We should believe in God because if we do believe in God and he doesn't exist, not much harm is done. But if we don't believe in God and he does, then we burn in hell for eternity. And so it's definitely better to believe. Now, to put it in secular terms, one of my professors in college said, and therefore Pascal clutched for the handrail of faith. So the way I think of it in secular terms is you might not need that handrail, but it's safer to hold on to it than not to. But most scientists don't like talking about science in the context of faith because it seems to imply that maybe in some ways science is a leap of faith. And science isn't supposed to be about faith. Science is supposed to be about evidence, about informed conclusions based on the weight of empirical evidence. But the problem is that most people have no idea how to judge whether scientific claims are true. Even many scientists themselves may not know how to judge claims in areas outside of their own expertise. So the reality is that for those of us who do trust science, in many ways, like Pascal, we are assuming that the risks of accepting most scientific claims are smaller than the risks of rejecting it. So if you think about COVID-19, the risk of wearing a mask is a fairly small thing, but the risk of not wearing a mask and getting very sick or even suffering a fatal illness is pretty darn great. So the question is, should we do this? Should we trust science? And if so, why? What is the argument for confidence in scientific conclusions? The traditional answer to this question, which many of us may have been taught in school or university, is the scientific method, that scientific findings are reliable by virtue of the method that scientists use. Typically, that method is proposed or assumed to be what philosophers call the hypothetical deductive method. That is to say, scientists develop a hypothesis, deduce its consequences, and then observe to see whether or not those consequences obtain in the world. If they do, then we're happy. We say the hypothesis is true and we move on. If the consequences do not obtain, then we go back and revise, adjust, or develop a new hypothesis. Now, as a historian of science, I would say that scientists sometimes do this, and we do have some very famous examples. One very well-known example involves the test of Einstein's theory of general relativity. The theory of relativity proposed that because space-time was bent, that light traveling past a massive body would in fact be deflected by the effect of that massive body on the structure, the shape, the texture of space-time. And this was predicted, this was then tested in a very famous piece of scientific work by Sir Arthur Eddington, the so-called Eddington Eclipse Expedition, in which they actually looked at the position of starlight moving on a path close to the sun, and was able to show that indeed the path of the starlight was deflected. And this was held up as a very brilliant example of the effective use of the hypothetico-deductive method. Now, philosophers sometimes refer to this as the deductive nomological model, because as we all know, academics need to use fancy words when simpler ones would do. But there's also a reason for it. Nomological means law-like, or having to do with laws. And in the ideal case, we aren't just developing a hypothesis about a specific question, we're searching out universal laws of nature. And again, we can identify in science some examples of universal laws, such as Einstein's famous expression, E equals mc squared, or Newton's expression, F equals ma. The problem with the hypothetico-deductive model as the model of science is that as a logical claim, it just doesn't actually work. And it doesn't work for a few reasons, but the most important of which is what philosophers call the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Just because a prediction turns out to be true does not in fact prove that the theory that made that prediction is true. And the reason for this, when you stop to think, is actually sort of obvious. A false hypothesis can still lead to a true prediction. So I can have a theory that is incorrect, and yet what it predicts might still come true. A famous, or perhaps the most famous example of this is the Ptolemaic model of the universe. So Ptolemy famously believed that the Earth was the center of the universe. For centuries, this was a widely accepted view, widely accepted scientific theory, and it made extremely accurate predictions of the motions of the planets, the timing of eclipses. In fact, it made more accurate predictions than the Copernican model when the Copernican model was first proposed. Yet today, we would say that it was wrong. The second problem involves what philosophers call auxiliary hypotheses. What that means is that when we test a hypothesis, we're not actually testing only that hypothesis, but we're also testing a variety of other assumptions that are built into the test. We're also testing the reliability and sensitivity of our instruments. So for example, if we do an experiment to test a theory, we're assuming that the instruments we're using to test that theory are reliable and sufficiently accurate to detect the effect of interest. But that's not always the case. So again, a famous example of this, continuing on the question of the Copernican theory. So when Copernicus came along and said, well, actually, I don't think the Earth is the center of the universe. I think the Earth actually moves around the sun, and so do all the other planets. Some people said, well, if that's true, if the Earth is moving, we should be able to detect its effects. And one of the effects that astronomers realized was predicted by the theory was the phenomenon of stellar parallax. That means the change in the apparent position of a star relative to the background stars as the Earth moves through its orbit. So imagine a bright star in the heavens, one that's easy to identify, like Polaris. We would see it in December at a particular angle, but come June, when the Earth had moved halfway around its orbit, we would see it from a different perspective. And that difference, that angular difference, is known as the stellar parallax. So astronomers looked for the stellar parallax and they found nothing. And so some people took this as a refutation of the Copernican theory. Now, today we would say that that's not right. We know that the Earth does move. So why did this test fail, even though the theory was correct? Well, today we would say that there was an auxiliary hypothesis embedded in this test, the hypothesis that the Earth's orbit was large relative to the distance to the sun. Today we would say that that auxiliary hypothesis was incorrect, that actually the Earth's orbit around the sun is very, very, very small compared to the distance to the stars, and therefore that the stellar parallax is very, very small. So these scientists were trying to find a very, very tiny effect, but they didn't realize how small it was. They thought it would be bigger than it was in fact. Now, so related to that then is we could say there was a second auxiliary hypothesis that their telescopes were sensitive enough to detect this effect. In fact, it wasn't until the 19th century, so about 200 years later, and the work of Sir William Herschel, that the stellar parallax was finally detected. So the idea wasn't wrong, the theory was correct, the test was conceptually correct, but the instruments were not sensitive enough to detect it. So we might say that the hypothetical deductive model is an oversimplified picture of the scientific method, and in some ways that would be fair. But the problem is deeper than that, because a good deal of science just doesn't follow the hypothetical deductive model. A good deal of science is what philosophers call inductive. What does that mean? Induction is the process of generalizing from observation. So rather than assuming that we begin with a hypothesis, we might begin with observations of the natural world, and we might then generalize those observations to develop our theories. Now, in the mid-20th century, inductive science would go out of fashion. There are fashions in science, like everything else, and many scientists would criticize inductive science as being, what Ernest Rutherford called stamp collecting. And this idea was particularly promulgated in the United States, that inductive science was a kind of weak science and that science should be deductive. And in fact, in my own work on continental drift, one of the things I showed was that physicists' hostility to inductive science was part of what made many American geologists and biologists think that they needed to actually change their science and to make it more deductive. Now, that was a project that in my view was misguided. Among other things, it contributed to the rejection of continental drift theory, again, a theory that we would now say was true. But perhaps even more important than that is that some of the most important work in the history of science was inductive. It's simply not the case that inductive science is bad science. And the most important example of this is Charles Darwin. So anyone who knows anything about Darwin's life knows that when he went on the voyage of the Beagle, he wasn't testing a hypothesis. He didn't really even know what he was doing. He just knew he didn't want to be a doctor. And so Darwin's work on the Beagle is very observational. He collects a lot of data. He collects a lot of information. He doesn't have a clear idea of what this information means or even why exactly he's collecting it. But eventually, after a long period of time, it leads to his theory of evolution by natural selection. Now, these are the two main ways of approaching science that historians and philosophers have written a lot about. There's at least a third area of science that we need to also acknowledge, which is modeling. Modeling is the attempt to understand the causes of things by reproducing them either physically, as in this case. This is a picture of the Scottish geologist Henry Cadell. You can tell he's a geologist because he's wearing Wellington boots and a deerstalker hat. And he is trying to understand how mountains form. And he's doing that by building physical models in which he attempts to reproduce the structures observed in mountains through a variety of different physical mechanisms. In this case, he's testing the idea that mountains are formed by horizontal compression, an idea that was very important in the debate that then ensued subsequently over continental drift theory. Now, nowadays, models typically are not physical models. They're typically computer models, but the concept is the same. We build a computer model to test ideas of what the causes of certain observed phenomenon could be. So in this case, this is an early climate simulation that is testing whether or not you could reproduce the observed temperature increases simply by natural phenomena like changes in solar radiation, or whether you have to add the forcing function, the effect of greenhouse gases. And what you see in this illustration is, this comes from an early IPCC report, that in order to reproduce the observed effects, you have to include all of these different things, changes in solar radiation, changes in sulfate aerosol content, but crucially, greenhouse gases. It's only the greenhouse gas effect that explains the big increase in global temperatures in the last 50 years or so. So what is the point of all of this? Well, the point of all of this is to say that there are many different scientific methods. At different times, in different places, and in different fields of study, scientists have used and preferred different methods. Sometimes they use the hypothetical deductive method. Sometimes they use inductive methods. Sometimes they engage in modeling. This diversity of methods led the philosopher Paul Feyerabend to say, if we ask what the method of science is, the answer is anything goes. But actually, that quotation is often taken out of context. Feyerabend wasn't actually saying that scientists could do any darn thing they wanted. What he said was that scientists are creative and intellectually open. And so therefore, he said, if you pressed me to say what the method of science was, I would have to say that the only principle that does not inhibit progress is anything goes. In other words, be open, be creative, be flexible. And scientists are indeed innovative and creative. And they choose methods that work for the problem or that they prefer for various reasons. And sometimes those reasons are good, sometimes not so good. But the key point is that different scientific problems may also call for different kinds of solutions. So then the question becomes, well, if there is no scientific method singular, then do these diverse methods have anything in common? And the answer is evidence. What makes science distinct from religion or some other forms of human activity is the central role of evidence. And all of these different methods that I've been discovering can be thought of as different means of collecting, creating, and generating evidence. So I would argue that evidence is the key element in scientific knowledge, not method. And it's more important for us to ask not what method did scientists use, but what evidence do they have? How much evidence? How robust is that evidence? How diverse? How well established? And that's a better basis for evaluating the stability of scientific claims than being judgmental about the particular kinds of methods that are being used. But of course, this just pushes back the question a little bit further, because who judges the evidence? Who decides whether the evidence is enough to say that something is known? And the answer to that, of course, is that scientists decide. And this then brings us to the importance of consensus in science. And this is an extremely important topic because it's something that has been, I think, often discussed in ways that can be unhelpful or misleading. Some people don't like the idea of consensus because it sounds like we're saying that science is just a bunch of opinions or it could just be groupthink. But I think that's wrong. I think that consensus is actually a crucial category in science because consensus tells us when scientists have reached the point that they believe that there is enough evidence of sufficient quality to say that something has been established. So what I would argue is that scientific knowledge, what we call scientific facts, are the body of claims that have been agreed upon by relevant scientific experts. Claims that these experts have concluded are supported by sufficient evidence of sufficient quality to say that they are true. Or put another way, scientific knowledge is the body of claims about which experts have come to consensus. And so consensus isn't a goal of science, rather consensus is a marker of scientific stability. Now this troubles some people because in some ways it can seem like an appeal to authority, that I'm just saying science is whatever scientists say it is. Well, I want to make the possibly controversial claim that in a way, science is based on appeal to authority, but it's a particular kind of authority. It's not the authority of an individual, no matter how brilliant or wise that individual may have been. It's the collective authority of diverse experts who have weighed and judged available evidence. And so I like this picture of science because if you ask yourself, well, what is this scientist in this picture doing? She's pointing at evidence and she's showing and sharing that evidence with her audience. Now, I have to say that I'm sometimes suspicious that these people really are scientists because they look too happy, but I guess she's got some pretty good evidence and her colleagues like it. So to say this again, scientific knowledge is the intellectual and social consensus of affiliated experts based on the weight of available empirical evidence. This evidence is not generated and evaluated according to a single, quote, scientific method, but a diverse and sometimes changing set of methodologies. These methods have changed with time. The methods that scientists use today are not identical to the methods that they may have used 300 years ago. But by and large, the methods that scientists use and rely on tend to be the ones that have stood the test of time. Another way of thinking of this is to say that in a way, science is a kind of jury, but it's a very special sort of jury. It's a jury of scientific peers, that is to say, a jury of other experts, other people who have trained in the same field in order to be able to understand the specificity of the claims in that field. So as a person trained in earth science, I'm not qualified or not well qualified to judge, say, claims in quantum physics, but neither is a quantum physicist well established or well prepared to evaluate claims in biomedicine. And so scientific expertise is specific and it's local. Now, there are other analogies we can think of. We can think of, in a way, science is a kind of crowdsourcing, but it's a very specific sort of crowd. And this is why the internet has become such a problem for science, because now you have people all over the world of unknown educational background, unknown expertise, weighing in on scientific claims about which often they're actually not experts at all. There's one more analogy we can make. So if we think about the history of technology, people often think of technology as being very different from science, and in some ways it is, but in some ways there's an important similarity. So think about the modern automobile. The modern automobile is a remarkably reliable device. Those of us who have cars, or I mean, like here in America, where most people drive to work every day, we get in our cars, we turn on the ignition, and the car starts. That's actually kind of an amazing accomplishment. So how did that happen? Well, it wasn't because of the genius of any individual engineer that produced the modern car. I have to say, I have to update this because my last car was a plug-in hybrid. I obviously now need a picture of a Tesla or a fully electric Volvo. But this accomplishment was not the result of the genius of any one individual engineer, but rather the accumulated work and expertise of thousands of automotive engineers who have worked on cars for more than a century. And science is like that as well. Our accumulated scientific knowledge is based not on the experience and expertise of one genius, but of many people working together over long periods of time. It works like our cars and so much of our technology because of this accumulated expertise and experience. But this is a claim about science as a process. We should believe in science as a process because by and large it has worked over time. So in a sense, this is a defense of the enterprise of science. So put another way, we should not trust scientists as individuals, but we do have good reason to have confidence in the process of which they are a part. Let me make one more consideration. So if we go back to Pascal and we ask ourselves, well, what are the relative consequences of accepting a particular claim if it is false versus rejecting if it's true? So I've given you an argument for trust in science as an enterprise, but now as individuals and citizens, we might have to evaluate a particular claim, a particular scientific claim in a particular moment. So how do we do that? And here's where I think Pascal's perspective remains relevant and helpful in the modern era. So if we think about the problem of climate change, the issue that I have worked on most closely, it becomes clear that with respect to climate change, we should accept the results of climate science, because if we don't, and it turns out the scientists were right, then the potential consequences are dire. If, on the other hand, it turned out to be a big hoax, well, then we will have created a better world for nothing. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much. What a wonderful talk. As a scientist, I'm always taken by how little of this I was exposed to in my science education, and how it's come, albeit in a welcome way later, and how enjoyable it is. So thank you so much for that wonderful lecture. There are some questions coming through. I'll go through them in a moment. Maybe I will begin, Naomi, by asking you, when you give these talks, how do scientists tend to respond to them? Well,
of course, it's a big mix, and science is a very big and complicated enterprise. I would say in general, many scientists have the response that you have, that they take the point, they see the point, but it comes as a bit of a surprise because they've been doing science all their lives. They're, have very extensive training, and no one ever stopped to ask these questions about, well, why should we believe these things? Or why what is the basis for our acceptance of claims by our fellow scientists, and particularly claims in other fields. Because I think many scientists are also often taught to think, well, if I'm a scientist, I can judge, claims in other fields, and not stopping to think that that's actually not true, right? So in general, I think scientists are receptive, and particularly because right now, because the problem of people not accepting scientific claims is so crucial, I do think a lot of scientists are open to the idea that we do need to sort of step back and think about these issues. But that said, there's always someone in the audience prepared to defend the hypothetical deductive method. And one of the things I talk about in the book is what I call methodological fetishism. Some scientists are very committed to the idea that there is a particular method that is right. This comes up a lot in biomedicine with the whole notion of the randomized clinical trial as the gold standard. And I have found that people in biomedicine who are heavily committed to RCTs as a gold standard tend to be a little bit more resistant. And so then you need to engage in a conversation about the notion of the right tools for the job, that RCTs are really good for some kinds of problems, but are completely inadequate for other kinds of problems.
Yes, indeed. And I liked that analogy that you talked about, the use of gold in your book, and that there's sometimes silver standards and bronze standards, and that they are useful too. Actually, it makes me think of a question. I'm fortunate enough to live with a philosopher who often tells me science doesn't know the way to engage with everything. Are there limits to where science can go or should go? I'm thinking about like the dangers perhaps of creating an epistemological hierarchy within the academy. Have you any comments on that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, well, this fits with my general philosophy about the right tools for the job. So exactly. I mean, the whole notion of a gold standard is really ridiculous. I mean, first of all, if you think of where it comes from in finance and currency, we abandoned the gold standard a long time ago. And there are still some people in the world who think we should bring it back. But most people recognize that that would be impossible, even if it would be desirable. And that's probably not desirable. But think about gold for a minute. Gold is a really great metal for jewelry because it's beautiful. And it's a great metal for electronics because it conducts electricity very well. But, you can't build a house of gold, right? And you couldn't even, use it to make a kitchen knife because it's too soft, right? So, different metals are good for different things. And the same with tools. I mean, imagine if you had a carpentry problem, you hired a carpenter to come to your house, and the carpenter showed up, opened his toolbox, and there was a hammer in it. You would think that's a weird kind of carpenter, right? Where are the screwdrivers and where, So we all have a kind of intuitive notion that life requires toolkits and different tools are appropriate for different jobs. And yet there is this weird thing that happens in science where some scientists seem to have lost sight of that. And they seem to think that one tool, like the RCT, could solve all their problems. And some scientists think that one science could solve all our problems, like that everything will be reduced to physics. And some scientists think that science can solve all our problems. Well, so those are all wrong, right? And so if we think about broader social problems, then it becomes quickly very clear that science is an essential component in solving major social problems like climate change, but by itself, it's insufficient. And you just have to look at the last year and COVID-19 to see this so clearly. And actually the introduction to the paperback talks about COVID-19. So think about what's happened in the world in this last year. Biological scientists did an amazingly good job very early on at identifying this virus, sequencing its DNA, proving that it was new, and now almost certainly that it came from bats, right? That it's some kind of variant of the bat virus. So this is really great scientific work. Thanks, scientists. And not only that, but then the immunologists and the virologists got to work in an incredibly short period of time, have produced multiple vaccines, many of which are proving extremely effective. And this is a great piece of scientific work. But, what's that? But it's not enough. Right, yeah, but it's not enough. Because let's just take the United States, which is the case I know the best. Here in the United States, we have fully of 25% of the American people who say they're not going to get the vaccine, right? And who are these people? Well, it turns out they're not randomly distributed to the population. They're very, very disproportionately young Republican men. So first of all, why is that? The biologists will not explain to us why Republican men resist vaccination, but the sociologists, the anthropologists, the historians, and the political scientists may be able to help us understand that. And if we want to do something about it, the vaccine could be the greatest vaccine in the world. I mean, it's kind of amazing when you think about it, that in only a year, Pfizer, BioNTech have produced a vaccine that's 95% effective. So this is amazing scientific accomplishment, but no amount of good genetics is going to explain how to fix the problem with people who don't want to get the vaccine. That's a sociological, psychological, cultural problem. And so we need both. We need both the natural science to develop the vaccine, but then we also need social science to help us figure out why so many people are resisting it and why particular people are resisting it, that it's not just random, that there's actually a cultural pattern involved.
Absolutely. I may follow with the question from Professor Heather Douglas, who thanks you for your talk and asks, do you think that scientists should display the processes that produce consensus?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for that question, Heather. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things we know about trust, and there's some pretty good evidence, from various social sciences, is that transparency, by and large, is good for trust. And if you have things that you think are embarrassing or awkward, sweeping them under the rug does not work, because eventually they come out and then people say, oh, you're hiding something. And the perception that you're hiding something is never good for building trust. So I am strongly in favor of the idea that scientists need to be honest and transparent about their processes, to demystify the process and to be honest about it and say, of course we make mistakes, we're humans. I think when scientists put themselves up as sort of, these demigod figures, it opens up a kind of vulnerability where then if some error is exposed, people say, aha, and then the schadenfreude comes pouring out. And I think we saw that in the incident of the stolen emails from East Anglia, sometimes referred to as ClimateGate, although I don't really like that term. What did we see in that instance? Well, we saw that scientists were humans, that some climate scientists were very frustrated by the effects of disinformation, and they were struggling with how to respond to it. And they expressed that anger and that frustration. And when that got exposed to the light of day, you had a lot of journalists saying, aha, see these guys, they're no good, they're saying mean things about people. Well, but if scientists would just open and say, yeah, sure, we're struggling with a lot of complicated things, having to face disinformation, having to face deliberate attempts to undermine your work is a really, really difficult thing for a professional to deal with. And we're trying to figure out what to do about it. And if those same scientists had actually reached out to social science colleagues to get help or to get advice, or friendly journalists, they could have done a much better job also handling it, and they would have been much less vulnerable to the attacks that then followed.
Well, actually, you've nicely segued to a question from John here in the panel, who asks about the role of intermediaries, people like journalists or teachers or science communicators. Where's the locus of their expertise here, and how do they interact with the scientists and the public?
Yeah, that's a great and complicated question. So I think interlocutors are really, really important. Again, one of the things that's come out of recent research in communications, but I think it's something that advertisers have always known, is the notion of the trusted messenger. We have a lot of evidence to suggest that most people make most of their decisions based on what people close to them have to say. That could be teachers, neighbors, could be their own doctor, could be nurses, someone they know in the community. And I think many of us have had the experience of having friends or neighbors ask our opinion. I mean, my husband's a hydrologist, and when we lived in California, every year there's some referendum on the ballot in California about water, and people would always ask me, well, what does Ken think about it, right? So, we trust, our networks of trust tend to be mostly local, or they involve people who we trust for reasons that are complicated, like celebrities, right? If we like a celebrity and the celebrity says, wear your mask, get a vaccination, that also can be influential. So it means that third parties are really, really important in science communication and building bonds of trust. But one of the challenges there, though, is that sometimes the third parties have their own agendas, which are different from the scientific ones. And I'm thinking here primarily of journalists. So one of the challenges scientists have in dealing with journalists is that journalists are very eager to report on the latest novel result. Because if it's not novel, it's not news. I mean, the very definition of news is that it's new. And this, I think, causes many journalists to overemphasize the latest, greatest breaking result which often turns out not to hold up to scrutiny when we do more work. And I think that has contributed in recent years to the perception among some members of the public that science is very unstable, that scientists are always changing their mind. Last week you said eat oat bran, this week you say, eat green beans. So I do think that journalists need to take on board a little bit about the way their own journalistic expectations or the demands of their profession can cause them actually to contribute to public misunderstanding of science. And I think scientists have to also understand that journalists are operating under those pressures. So, scientists, of course, are generally eager to get journalistic coverage for their work, and that's understandable, but it means that scientists have to be careful and say, well, look, it's just one study. We think this is significant. We think it's important and promising, but we know that we have to do follow-up work, and to be a little bit more careful about that, because scientists definitely fall into the hype mode. And we've certainly seen a lot of hype in, the area of, say, genetics and molecular biology in recent years. And so, scientists do share the responsibility for that as well.
Absolutely. I enjoyed the section of your book talking about that auto intoxication of kind of running away with yourself, indeed, and believing your own hype, which I think we can all be guilty of at times, particularly when we're at those key points in our career where we have to push ahead. There's a great question that's coming in from Arishak, and he asks about how does a scientist choose between rival hypotheses when there is there's disagreement as to the method that should be used.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question. And of course, this was something I looked at a lot in my first book, The Rejection of Continental Drift, because in that story, what we saw was different groups of scientists being very committed to certain kinds of approaches or certain data sets, and being somewhat loath to really take on seriously evidence that was coming from other, interrelated areas. So this is where I think the group aspect or the social or communal aspect of science is so important. Individual scientists can have all kinds of different reasons for committing to the particular approaches or hypotheses they do. Often that has to do with your training. You come out of a school of thought, you were trained by a particular professor who had a certain approach, and you tend to believe that that's the right one because that's what you were taught. And you might evolve and change as you grow up, or you might not. Or you tend to prefer evidence that comes from an area that you understand well. I mean, there's a tendency that I think all people have. I really understand this body of data. I don't really understand that data so well, so I'm going to go with this stuff that I understand. And so I think that's inevitable. I think that's how all human beings operate. And so that's okay. I don't fault humans for being human, but this is where the collective critical interrogation or the collective scrutiny is so crucial. So I may be committed to a particular approach, but then I go to a conference and I have to submit my claims to the critical scrutiny of my colleagues who will say, well, that's all very well and good, but what about this other evidence? And then I'm forced to take that other evidence into account, even if I don't want to. And so that's why in the book, I really emphasize this idea that, this isn't new to me. I mean, a lot of philosophers, particularly feminist philosophers, have really argued strongly for this point, that it's that critical scrutiny, the critical interrogation from a variety of different angles that makes science powerful, makes science strong, because it means it's not just my views, it's not just what I prefer, but it's the claim that can withstand scrutiny from a variety of different perspectives. And so then this leads into the argument in the book about diversity. It's why it's so important that scientific communities are diverse. And by that, I mean, not so much racial diversity as intellectual diversity, but we know, again, from lots of research, that intellectual diversity is related to life experience and therefore related to racial and gender diversity as well. And so this is an argument for why demographic diversity is really essential to science. It's not just a nice thing. It's not just doing the right thing ethically, although it is the right thing ethically, but it's also crucial epistemologically, because if our communities are not diverse and we're all looking at something in the same way, then there's a good chance we're going to have blind spots and we're going to miss important perspectives and information.
And I think, it strikes me many in the social sciences have done that very well for a long time. There's many papers I would read that have a section called positionality. Do you think that's something that perhaps could be more broadly used across the sciences? I can imagine a physicist writing about their positionality when it comes to their paper on quarks, for instance. Right.
Well, that would be a big challenge, because most scientists are still in the model that their positionality doesn't matter, right? I think most scientists still subscribe to an individual notion of objectivity, that my objectivity inheres in me as a kind of moral quality, right? It's a testament to my moral fiber that I am objective. And I think that that's actually a very unscientific approach. I think everything we're learning from cognitive science shows that no matter how much we may try to be objective, we're going to bring our positionality and our perspectivalism to the table. And so it would be good if scientists were more scientific about that. If they were more self-aware, I would like to see a greater degree of self-awareness among scientists. Whether you need to have, a chest-beating paragraph in the paper about your positionality, I don't know. That might be going a little far, but maybe not. I mean, increasingly, we are recognizing that scientists need to disclose their funding sources. I mean, as recently as 10 or 20 years ago, many scientists did not. And we do know we have huge amounts of evidence, scientific evidence that funding sources can influence our positionality. And so we've recognized that, and many journals, most journals now do require financial disclosures. So maybe we should have positionality disclosures, and it could be part of the financial disclosure. I got my money from here, but I also acknowledge that I was trained in this particular school of thought. I don't know. I think scientists would probably be resistant to it, but the very fact that they're resistant might be proof that it's a good idea. I don't know.
just thinking, what harm could it do? And perhaps philosophers of science and historians of science could use that themselves to do further research. There's a great question here coming in from Constantina, who again thanks you. There's all of these questions are thanking you for your wonderful talk. And this question says, in the absence of a consensus, can we tell what science do we trust? How, there is the trade-offs when there is there isn't that consensus that there might be in other issues. And I suppose we can probably see it playing in real time at the moment around some aspects of COVID-19 and living through a pandemic. So where do we place our trust when consensus isn't obvious?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, it's a very difficult one. So I think one of the first things that my work points to is the importance of actually understanding consensus and being clear about when there is and when there isn't, because we've certainly seen claims that sometimes people will make saying, oh, there's no consensus, when actually there really is, and the opposite, claiming that there's consensus when actually there's informed dissent. And this is where historians, philosophers, sociologists, anthropologists of science can play a really, really important role, because we have the toolkit to say, well, hold on, is there a consensus or not? And is this argument that's taking place, is that a scientific argument taking place inside the scientific community, or is it political contestation, which is a different sort of kettle of fish? So understanding those differences are really important. If there really isn't a consensus, then the next step is to try to identify, well, what is the basis of the disagreement? And sometimes we can find that the basis of disagreement has to do with different cultural standards. So one example I like to use has to do with chemical regulation in the United States versus Europe. So we know that there are chemicals that are allowed in the United States that are not permitted in consumer products in Europe. Now, why is that? Well, largely because the European Union has taken a more precautionary approach to chemical risk than the United States. So in that case, you could make a judgment and you could say, well, as an individual, I prefer the European stricter standard. And I'm using this example because I actually do this in my own life. Sometimes when I'm not sure about something, I will look and I'll say, well, what are the Europeans doing, right? And it doesn't mean I'll always necessarily follow the Europeans on everything, but just so you know, I mean, for more than a decade now, whenever I'm in Europe for a talk, I stock up on sunscreen because American sunscreens are filled with potentially dangerous endocrine disrupting chemicals, which European sunscreens in general don't have. So that's just one example. A different person could say, well, I'm really not worried about that. I'm 62 years old. I've had my children. I'm not really worried about endocrine disrupting chemicals, and I'd rather pay less money for a cheaper, sunscreen. So those are kinds of choices you could make when you understand what the basis of the disagreement is. And that's just one example, but there are many others. And sometimes it can be hard to figure out what the basis of the disagreement is. And again, that's where social scientists can really help. But, in the case of the sunscreen, it's actually not that hard. And so you can make a decision. And if you don't travel to Europe regularly, as I used to do, and I don't know if I will or won't do in the future, you can find French sunscreen, in America.
Probably at huge cost. There's a great question for
right. It is more expensive. So then you have to, but then you get into the whole area of value judgment. You can decide if it's worth it to you to pay that extra cost or not.
And I can assure you the opposite is true. When Europeans travel to the United States, there are things we'll stock up on that may be a little trickier to get here. A question from Christina Rowland, who says, many philosophers think that trust has a moral dimension. It is not enough to rely on the consensus of experts. One needs to have evidence of their honesty, their goodwill towards citizens who are dependent on them. What might be such evidence, she asks.
You mean evidence of their moral quality?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. Well, that's a really great question. It actually relates to this issue of funding. So one of the arguments I have made about funding in science and about transparency is that people are right to be cautious, if not suspicious, if a scientist doing research on drug safety is funded by the drug industry. That does create a potential conflict of interest, and that's a legitimate reason to be concerned. And this came up in my own university not that long ago. I actually just wrote a piece for Scientific American, which I can post if people are interested. So as some people know, Harvard University and others as well, but I write about Harvard because that's where I live and work, took a lot of money from the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. And even after it became known that he had, done these illegal and immoral things, there were people in the university who pressed for continuing to accept money from this man. Now, to the credit of my university, just to make it clear, the president at the time, Drew Faust, said, no, we won't do that. But it turned out that she came under a lot of pressure from some of her own deans and faculty, I might say all men, by the way, that this money should be accepted on the grounds that, well, it supports science and science is good, so therefore, it must be good. Now, I don't think most people view it that way. And the fact that this people in this scientific community couldn't or wouldn't see that does not speak well to their moral compass. And the metaphor I used was that their moral compass had been deflected by the magnetism of money. So I do think that the scientific community has to have a much more serious conversation about this issue, and to think that, we could just take money from anyone, no matter how corrupt, immoral, or illegal, and that it's all fine because it supports science. I mean, I don't think that's a credible argument in the eyes of most people, certainly not a credible argument to me. And yet I've heard many, many scientists make that argument. So I would like to see the scientific community have a much deeper conversation about how our own actions influence how people see us as moral agents, because I think that question is absolutely right. The people we trust are people who we see as good for whatever reason. And it could be they're good because they're great actors, right? I mean, there's some weird disconnects that the thing that we use to judge a person as good might actually have very little to do with their moral compass. But nevertheless, people are making judgments about, who to trust based in part on our judgment of, what kind of a person we think they are. And that's really important for us to understand.
Absolutely. We could ask you questions all afternoon, but don't worry, we won't. I have one more here for you, perhaps, and we'll stay on for a few moments after the talk officially ends and perhaps chat about one or two others. But we have to let Naomi go and start her day in Harvard. This one is from Tony Ward, who asks, how do we distinguish between trustworthy consensus and an echo chamber of people who share certain assumptions? Tony gives the example of perhaps forensic science, people who use the lie detector test, bullet analysis, etc. They'll all kind of agree within them, within their communities, that it works, although perhaps he suggests that they haven't been vigorously tested.
Right. Well, this gets back to the question I raised earlier about the appeal to authority, groupthink, echo chambers. And there's no question that's a real risk, and it's something that has to be considered. But I think in some of these cases, like the lie detector case, again, this is where history can play a useful role. We can ask the question, well, what is the scientific basis of this? Is there a robust body of peer-reviewed, replicated data that supports the reliability of this? Or is this something that a different community, say the law enforcement community, ran with because they thought it was useful to them? And again, this is a good example where you could look at the dissent and who's dissenting. So here in the United States, lie detector tests are routinely used by employers in employment and hiring, for example, because there's no law that prevents them from doing that, but they are not admissible in courts of law. And they're not admissible in courts of law because they don't actually meet the so-called Daubert standard, that's the standard here in the United States, for having a body of vetted science behind it. So in that case, we can say, yes, there are people who use lie detectors. I mean, I think the CIA uses it as well, but I mean, the fact that the CIA uses it might be proof that it's bad. No, I'm just kidding. But, I mean, the point is we can actually look at, we can look at who's using it, why are they using it, and is there the kind of body of science behind it that there ought to be? And in some of those cases, we can say, no, there isn't. And so the standards of history and philosophy of science can be invoked to make that argument.
Well, Professor Oreskes, thank you so much for your wonderful talk and wonderful questions and answers session at the end. Before people sign off, I might invite them to our next talk, which is in 2 weeks' time with Professor Kassan, who's from Warwick University and will be speaking on misunderstanding conspiracy theories. And you can register for that talk in the same way you registered for this via the PERITIA website. As Maria mentioned at the beginning of today's talk, we're preparing a podcast series of these talks, and they'll be available in due course from the PERITIA website. So we'll officially thank Naomi again. And Naomi, I can assure you that every one of the many, many questions that have come in have been so engaged, so long indeed, so up for it, which is wonderful. And I again thank you for such a great contribution this afternoon. So thank you so much for that. So we'll be staying on for a moment now to follow up a little bit more, and perhaps we'll ask Naomi about her latest book. I see that my colleague